Have you ever fallen for the middle-sized Starbucks cup after you saw the big one and the small one? Well, that is our brain reacting to the third decoy theory, a behavioral economics principle. Our brain plays a big role when it comes to making decisions. And at some point or the other, all of us have fallen prey to it. And the same applies when we make financial decisions as well. Behavioral psychologists and economists have spent years on research to understand the behavioral biases that influence what we do with our money. There are a bunch of biases such as optimism bias, loss aversion bias, status quo bias, overconfidence, herd behavior, etc., that come in the way of making rational financial decisions. In fact, modern theory of investor decisions making suggests that investors do not always act rationally while making an investment decision. Hi there, I am Tanya Marwah, and welcome to a brand new episode of Insuring India, a podcast by Digital Insurance. On this episode, we have with us Anya Samek, Associate Professor of Economics and Strategy, Rady School of Management at University of California, San Diego. Anya's work on various topics, including charitable giving, education, and health, includes over 100 academic questions. Among the other papers, her work analyzes how different modes of education can affect early childhood learning and adult financial decision making. So, hi Anya, welcome to Insuring India, and thanks so much for giving us your time. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here.
So, Anya, when you agreed to have this chat with us, honestly, the first thing that I was excited about personally was that I'm about to learn from you about the power of prompts and how it can be used to make kids choose healthy eating. And actually, I'm a mother myself of a 2-year-old, as I was telling you before this call, and I'm kind of set on helping him make better food choices. So, for our listeners, could you first help us understand what are prompts and how do they affect human behavior?
I'm sure. So I also am a mother. I have two daughters, a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old. When I started a lot of this research, I didn't have my own kids, but what we were doing is going into school lunchrooms and working with parents directly to try to encourage healthier eating behavior. And I think the idea here is that we've approached historically the idea of improving healthy eating through educating people. So maybe if we provide you with more education about nutrition, maybe you're going to make better choices. Maybe for kids, we have classes on nutrition, etc. But it turns out that people already have the information, but they often don't take the steps that are the best for them. And so
Right.
that's where prompts and nudges come in. So this idea comes from behavioral economics that in the time of the decision, perhaps you can change something about that environment to prompt people into healthier choices. Because at the time of the decision, just think about yourself. If you walk into your a meeting at work and they're offering snacks there and you've told yourself, I'm going to eat healthy today, but then there's delicious sweet foods and then you're going to eat it anyway. You're not thinking in your mind about the education that you've had about nutrition, right? And so that's kind of the idea, is that people need more than education to try to improve choice. And so what we did with the prompts is we had a really simple experiment. We had kids in a school lunchroom who walk through the lunchroom, and in the US, they pick a tray of food, and then they have a couple of choices about different side items that they can pick. Some drinks that are sweeter drinks, and then some drinks that are not sweetened. And what we do is we try to nudge them to choose the healthier drink option. And so there we have the cafeteria worker just say, oh, try this one. And we try to add some kind of information to that. Like, try this one, it tastes good, for the ones that are the healthier. And so we get kids to choose healthier that way. But unfortunately, what I have to tell you is that what works the best is when we give kids rewards. So anytime you provide an incentive, for adults, it's a financial incentive often. So a big discount or a big bonus. For kids, we actually put little stickers that they could keep on top of the drinks that were healthier. And that's really what works the best. So nudges work to some extent, but it's the incentives that end up being the most powerful.
That's something that I do, feel with my kid as well. But in the long term, do these incentives, do the kids, like for example, depend on the incentives to choose the right behavior, or does it become a part of their attitude towards food?
So you're asking a question that's still an open question in the literature, and it's this idea of, do incentives help kids or adults form better habits over time, or do incentives reduce the intrinsic motivation to eat healthy in the first
Okay.
place? And it's really hard to study that question because you need a lot of experiments that last for a long period of time. And this is something that we're investigating now. We think there's some evidence that incentives form habits. So the more you eat that food through getting the incentive, once we remove the incentives, we do see that kids are still choosing the healthy food more often, but we only run it for a few weeks. And so I think one thing is, yes, there's some possibility that habits are formed. But the other thing we're kind of learning too is that these choices that we make we face a lot of, there's a lot of desire to eat the unhealthy food, and that doesn't go away. And so I think having different types of incentives or nudges through time is important. So we can't expect to run some program when the child is 2, and then
Right.
from there on, when they're 3, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, they're going to suddenly be healthy eaters because they were in that initial kind of nudges program,
Right.
right? So it sort of has to be, you have to create environments that all the time help promote healthier behaviors or better financial behaviors,
Right.
because people are impulsive. They'd rather choose the thing that's worse for them, that makes them happy in that moment, than to think ahead for their future.
All right. So, Anya, like for example, when you talk about adults, and you did briefly mention adults as well, that nudges work on adults as well. Um, there is this concept that when you grow up, logic is also something that you do understand, right? So you don't expect probably a child. I know that as a mother, I do try and explain, but that's not something I expect my son to understand. But when you talk about adults, you do expect that behavior. So there, what is the, if I have to make it into a percentage, then how much of logic and how much of nudging should one use? And how different is it with adults when you talk about nudges?
So no one's looked at a study that directly compares adults and kids, but we
Sure.
have also run studies with adults. So my favorite project that we did over the course of the last couple of years is we looked at the food choices people make for their current self versus for their future self. So we all have an idea of what we'd like to eat next week. And
Right.
then when next week comes around, we actually can observe what you end up choosing to eat. And so the way we did that is we were in a grocery store and we had people participate in a food delivery program. So people came in and they had a choice of 20 foods, and there were things in there like pastries and buns and breads. And then there were also things in there like vegetables and fruits. And so they could form a basket of foods that they wanted to be delivered to their house next week. And then when we arrived at their house with the delivery, we allowed them to change their mind. And so the choice they make in the grocery store for next week, we think of that as the choice for their future self. And the
Right.
choice that they make when they are allowed to change their mind, basically, we bring all the same items that were available before, and we say, if you want, you can switch things around. We think of that as a choice for the immediate self. And those two things don't match. And so it turns out that many people make healthier choices when they're picking groceries for their future consumption than when they're picking groceries in the moment. So people are taking the candy instead and giving back the cucumbers and the apples that they thought that they were going to eat. And so it does show that among adults, this is also a problem. But if you also think about the other study we ran was with parents of kids, where parents were choosing snacks for their kids. And there's this idea that when your kid is crying and wants the unhealthy snack, you also give in and give it to them. So I think between the kids and the parents, there's a lot of this impulsivity that happens, and those are kind of this impulsive nature of humans is what we try to nudge through these incentives and through changing the environment.
Right. So, Anya, that's something very interesting because I remember when I joined Digit, and I don't come from an insurance background. We went through this entire research where we were meeting people and understanding from them how do they make financial decisions, how do they work around with insurance. And if because it's an aided research, and it's like people are answering for themselves and also for their futures. They have absolutely correct answers where basically they will say that I do need insurance, I need to buy insurance for my family, etc. But when you do ask them, do you have insurance right now? The answer is no.
Mhm.
For various reasons. This month, I, purchased this instead of insurance. I purchased this instead of, buying another financial product. So I think that's the similar pattern which we see in financial decision making as well. So what has been your experience with that? How does this kind of behavior, which is impulse versus future self, work when you talk about financial decision making?
I think you have it exactly right that these kinds of behavioral biases that we observe in people are manifest themselves in all of these different domains. So they happen in food choice, they happen in exercise. So people will
Right,
make a membership and then they don't go to the gym.
right,
And it happens also in financial decisions where when we ask people, do you want to save for the future? They say yes. And then when they're actually choosing whether to save, they don't save. So a really nice example of um, where we see kind of disconnect is also with the way that we create the choice environment. So I think the difference between food and insurance or saving is that we can kind of we want to try to improve the choice environment there to maybe make it easier for people to make that choice, but it's harder
right.
for us to intervene, I think, with nudges in that space.
All right. So you're saying it's harder to intervene with nudges in the space of financial decision making?
I think there's another aspect of financial decision making that makes it different from food, and that's that it's much more complex. And
Right,
so another thing that I think happens is people procrastinate complex decisions. And
right,
there's a really nice study on retirement saving enrollment decisions in the US. So in the US, we have 401k plans that are offered through your employer. And this is a retirement savings plan where basically part of your salary goes every month automatically into this
right,
401k plan. And they're confusing, and you have to make decisions about how to invest in them. And many people don't opt into the plan. But what
right,
they do in the study is they randomly assign some of the new employees to be automatically opted in. And so they have to opt out. And so they change it from an opt in to an opt out. And they suddenly see a lot of people who switch to having the 401k plan because they simply do nothing when the decision is complex. So
right,
one of the things that I think is sort of nice in that kind of setting is that when decisions are complex, people are even more susceptible to nudges actually because their
right,
preferences are not as well defined. So
right,
you might know for sure what your preference is for a chocolate candy versus a cucumber, but you know much less kind of your preferences around some of these financial products. So in that way, nudges work well,
right.
but you do face this same problem where people kind of have the impulse to spend their money on other things. This product that's kind of confusing. It's
Right.
doesn't seem important in the moment, and so it's put off to the future. So procrastination is a big part of these biases as well.
Right. So, along with procrastination, which we also, I mean, have faced, and we've been also as a company fighting that at the various stages. Actually, as an entire industry, insurance has been fighting procrastination, especially for insurance categories. Like in India, motor insurance is
Mhm,
mandated by law. But when it comes to health insurance, that's not something which is mandatory for people. So
mhm,
that's where people procrastinate. Along with that, there have been biases that we see, like optimism bias in people, where they think that, I am very healthy, nothing is going to happen with me. Especially for youngsters,
mhm,
actually, they say that, when you are healthy is the best time you should get a health insurance. But unfortunately, that's when your mind tells you this is not the right time,
mhm.
right? So, what have been the other biases you've been seeing with procrastination that make people say, for example, in a case like insurance, it is optimism bias. What other biases in overall, like you have been studying a lot on risk diversification, where do people go wrong, or what are the biases that are at play, so that people can kind of know that this is my mind doing it. So what can be the biases we can tell them?
I think this idea of time preferences and overweighing the present for the future is a really
Right.
big one that kind of covers a lot of this. So overweighing the present means that I'd rather spend my money on something I can have now than put it into health insurance that may or may not help me later. Present
Right.
bias also explains why every day that goes by, I choose to procrastinate getting an insurance plan. And so I
Right.
think that's a really big one. One study that we're working on writing up right now is in the US, health insurance is mandatory, but there are these enrollment windows that happen for a couple of weeks each year, and you have to enroll within that window. Otherwise, you may not qualify. And so one thing that we see
Right.
is that most people enroll on the very last day, even though they have the whole couple of weeks to do it. On the very
Right.
last day, they go in and they pick their plan and they enroll. And that could be a problem because we also see some evidence that a lot of people miss that deadline then, and then there are some penalties involved. But
Right.
we also potentially might have this idea problem where when you are under time pressure, your choices are not as good. And so one thing we did is we offered people $25 gift cards on the day they enrolled. So this isn't a very big incentive relative to the penalty you might face if you don't have insurance.
Right.
And it's not even a very big amount relative to how much you pay for your insurance plan. But
Right.
these $25 gift cards, which were immediate, basically we actually mailed people the gift card and then we loaded it with $25 immediately when you got the insurance. So it was like you get this money right away. It turns out those had a big impact on getting more people to sign up earlier. So I
Right.
don't know if it would have an impact on getting people to sign up at all because that wasn't our
Right.
study. We
Right.
definitely had a big effect. So here I think is a good example of how you can harness the biases people have in the first place to build your nudges, is that you people want immediate rewards. So you try
Right.
to provide immediate rewards even when they are enrolling in a product which has kind of long-term rewards
Sure.
rather
Sure.
than immediate rewards. So you bundle your products with things that make people excited right now. And I think
Right.
that can help beyond just education about the importance of these things.
Absolutely. So, Anya, you also have done a lot of study around behavioral manipulations, and I think the example that you did mention is somewhere in the manipulations zone as well. So, what are the other behavioral manipulations that you have seen working with people to make decisions earlier? So, one is like, say, for example, a gift card that works out. What are the other nudges slash manipulations that work with people to, make the right decisions for themselves?
Make the right decisions. I think I like the incentives the best. So as I mentioned, I think those are going to always work better than any kind of nudge you can have. Other things that people are very responsive to are learning about what people around them are doing. So
Sure.
if I believe that very few people have insurance, but then I learn that actually most people in my company also have health insurance, that might encourage me to purchase health insurance. So we
Right.
see that also in the charitable giving literature that I work in, where when you're deciding whether to give to a charity or not, learning about how many other people in your class have also given to that charity really encourages people to give. So we call that peer effect. So the effects of what
Right.
peers are doing, that's a pretty strong, um, has a pretty strong impact.
Sure.
In some of my other work, like you mentioned, my work on financial diversification, that's a little bit different. So there we're thinking about this problem where insurance decisions are hard, financial decisions are hard, and how do we simplify those in a way that's easy to understand? So rather than offering a lot of classes on how to understand the material we currently provide about these
Right.
products, can we actually design a decision tool that helps walk people through that decision without having the education, or without having, even I had the education, but maybe it was in college and now it's 5 years later and I don't remember.
Right.
So I think simplifying the decision space when it comes to financial decisions can also be very important.
Right.
And providing visual ways figuring out visually how to represent things, figuring out like even showing like a visual of all the people that are in your age category, how many of them end up using insurance. These are kinds of information that as economists, we think people are able to gather on their own, and that people do gather on their own, but I think that they don't. So people really don't seek out this kind of complex information. And so providing it can also be helpful.
Right, right. So basically, in this kind of a social grouping, what I do realize is that, uh, I every person categorizes themselves in some kind of a group. It can be basis age, it can be basis gender, life
Mm-hmm.
stage. So that is how, people kind of say that, okay, if a 30-year-old or 40-year-old like me is not having insurance and I'm kind of left out, or for example, if I'm not purchasing this kind of a SIP, then I'm kind of left out. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so when you talk about breaking down decisions, does that also mean that as a financial services provider, it is better to not overload people with a lot of information and not give them too many decisions as well? Or is it just breaking it down?
I think that's a very good question. So I gave a talk, this is 10 years ago now, at a health insurer in the US. And so
Sure.
I was talking about information overload. So this is this idea that we as insurers or we as academics might think that more information and more options are better. So the more options I can provide, the more likely it is that every person could find the best option for them. But it turns out that's not really how it works. And so at this health insurer I was meeting with, I was telling them, when people have information overload, they kind of give up. They just try to find the first thing that seems like a good idea.
Right.
And the insurer everybody there was so excited to learn about information overload. And they're like, this exactly explains what happened last year when we offered our employees 100 different plans and like this binder. We thought every employee could find the best plan for them, but it turned out that most people pick the very first plan in the binder. So they just look at the binder, it's really big, and they say, okay, what should I do? They pick the first plan or the second plan. And they were saying, we were so confused because those weren't the best plans. So some of the other plans were actually much better in terms of being cheaper, but still offering the same coverage.
Right.
And it's clear people can't make those calculations on their own. So the fewer things that you can provide, the better. And we also devised a tool to help people compare plans. We tested this in a lab environment, but basically we show people for their age category what we think their medical expenditures will be. And then
Sure.
for each plan that they have access to, we show them the costs under that plan for any possible outcome that you might have. And we show it in a graph, so it's just on one page. And that helps people really understand kind of the benefits of insurance in a very simple way. And I
Right.
think as much as we can, providing information about what your peer group faces, like the
Right.
likelihood of your peer group having this type of surgery or having this type of illness and how that affects your expenditures with and without insurance. I think that should help people understand the value a little bit better than right now, where right now it's a little bit
Right.
abstract. So we give them numbers, but people are not great at understanding, especially probabilities. People are not great at understanding probabilities.
Right. Right, right, absolutely. And I think there's this entire negativity around the whole concept of insurance because of the nature of the job that we do, which is basically protecting or cushioning people when they are in their worst times. And often as a communication person, we struggle in this uh, decision of how much negativity is good when we're talking to people, and because negativity is important because that's the entire idea that we are trying to communicate, especially when we talk about life insurance, though we are a general insurance player, but we see this pattern also coming around in life, and there the topic that you're dealing with is death, right? So I can talk about hospitalization, I can talk about an accident, but as soon as the word death comes into the picture, I think everybody's mind just kind of closes down. So,
Mhm.
in your opinion, and is how can we make this conversation about death easier for people? How is that possible, and is that possible, firstly?
So that's a little bit outside of economics, I think. Maybe a mental health expert would have more insight, but I think framing it in terms of protection for your family if something should happen is probably a good thing to do. So I think trying to focus on this idea of how does your family through time have a good standard of living should anything happen, whatever that might be, is probably the best. So I think rather than focusing on death, focusing on
Right.
the insurance aspects, right? On the positives of having insurance during difficult times.
All right. So last question, Anya, and as we close the talk, um, when we're talking to youngsters, what would be the best way to communicate to them, especially at the time when they're, having the first salary or, the first package of their lives? How do we communicate the idea of, like risk diversification? And the biggest risk is their health, firstly, and especially at
Mhm.
the time when they feel that they are like on top of the world, they're the healthiest, everything is going great. What is the best way to nudge or manipulate their behavior, as you mentioned, uh, to make a decision that is good for their future selves? So how do we make them choose the right diet for their future, financial planning?
That's a great question. I think we need to do much more to try to understand the best ways, but I would say anything you could do to make that decision have positive immediate rewards,
Sure.
like maybe there's recognition or parties or kind of gift cards that they get or some special gifts that make them feel like they made the right choice, but they're also being rewarded in the moment. I think these are the kinds of things that probably work well in tandem with providing education, because it's really tricky, I think, to nudge people when they are not looking to the future. There was an interesting study I once listened to where people used technology to try to make people's faces look older. And then they showed that when I show people images of how they'll look when they're 40, that makes them identify more with their older self, and it makes them make decisions that are more aligned with their with their future goals, because it's hard to imagine what will be the world will be like or how you will be like when you're older. People have a really tough time with that. So I guess immediate rewards, and then anything you could do to link kind of, not suggesting everybody gets a picture of how they'll look when they're 40, but anything you could do to make people more identify with how with their future self can help to kind of make that the weight on the well-being of your future self bigger.
Right. All right. Anya, I mean, I am kind of already feeling quite rich with the insights that you've told me as a
Perfect.
as a communicator, as a person from the insurance industry, as a financial planner myself for my own family. I think there's so many things that I've come to know, especially the whole idea of, how one plans for one's future self. I think the best insights in any field are the ones that you listen to and you can say that, oh, I have come across this. So I one should always remember this whole concept of, how people pick on their future self for even things like food. And that's the simplified version of how people choose for their financial decision making. So whoever is listening to us and is from the industry or is a consumer themselves, I think don't forget this example. And whenever you're buying or making any future financial decision, just think you're planning for yourself 10 years down the line. So thank you, Anya. And again, thank you so much for joining us. And I'm sure people will really enjoy, and they will probably think about diversifying their risk more after this, and maybe even eating better. Thank you
Thank you
so much.
so much. It was great to be here.